everyone, I'm Hone, and for the last week or so I've posted a ton of videos about the Dominaria limited format. I've talked about my opinions and expectations for all the cards that are in the set, and now I'm going to do my usual archetype guide. In this video I talk about all the different synergies that exist within each color pair, what each color pair is trying to do, and the cards you should be on the lookout for if you're trying to make these synergistic decks. Keep in mind, in this video I'm not going to be talking about cards that are just like premium removal and good in every deck unless they happen to have some special synergy with a particular color pair. If you're interested in seeing more about particular cards, like the most powerful cards in certain colors and things like that, you can check out the full set limited review, and I'm also going to be posting soon my picks for just the best commons and uncommons in each color and in artifacts. But for today we're doing archetypes. We're going to look at all 10 color pairs. This video has a tendency to get pretty long, so in the description below there should be a table of contents where you can jump to each archetype you're interested in looking at. So every two color combination in Dominaria has a signpost uncommon. In this set, they happen to all be legendary creatures, which is pretty cool. This set has a ton of legendary creatures. So for each of these color pairs, we're going to start by looking at these legendary creatures and figuring out where it is they want to take us. So again, these signpost uncommons are cards that are there to help us understand what a certain color pair wants to do. And in blue-red, we have Adeliz, the Cinder Wind, which is definitely telling us what we should be doing here. It's a powerful card. Basically, all the signpost uncommons are, so they're good payoffs for being in a particular color pair, and that's kind of the point. But Adeliz is really strong. So a 2/2 flying haste for 3 is already a good deal. But it has two other things going on. It wants you to cast instants or sorceries so that it can pump all other wizards, not all creatures, but just wizards. So it has a wizard sub-theme and an instant or sorcery sub-theme. Generally, the deck's going to be at its best when you maximize both, when you can get a lot out of both having wizards and having spells. So let's look at some of the other wizard payoffs, though, first of all, that are in this set at common and uncommon. So, for example, we have Academy Journeymaid, which costs 1 less if you control a wizard, and then it's a really good card. It's just a good card if you can't cast it for 4. There's also Wizard's Retort, which goes from being a sideboard card as cancel to being a counterspell in a deck with a lot of wizards in it, so that's a good payoff because counterspell is very playable. Fire Fist Adept, I think, is one of the best payoffs. It's probably the best, well, we'll see. It's a really good payoff at common or uncommon for wizards. It can basically become Flame Tongue Kavu if you have enough wizards in play, so you really want to jam a bunch of wizards into your deck when you have Fire Fist Adept. There's Get to Journey Mage, which has a less exciting payoff, but hey, it does 2 additional damage if you happen to control another wizard. And Wizard's Lightning is also very strong, and you know, that's the one I sort of said, well, maybe not Fire Fist Adept, but Wizard's Lightning, the difference between the two is that Wizard's Lightning is good in any deck, and Fire Fist Adept is only going to be good in this deck. So you'll probably be able to get your hands on more Fire Fist Adepts than Wizard's Lightnings, because everyone will take those. Even if you're casting it for 3, it's great. But in this deck, it goes from being Open Fire to being Lightning Bolt, which is a huge upgrade. It's also an artifact equipment that is sort of geared towards the wizard deck. You know, kind of weird that it's equipment. But if you equip it to a wizard, your wizard can tap and do 2 damage to a player or planeswalker. It can only do 1 if the creature is a non-wizard. So those are the payoffs at common and uncommon. You're going to see them considerable amount. If you want to be in this deck, these are the ones that you really want to take, especially if you're pushing the wizard part of the blue-red deck a lot. So the other half of the wizard deck is the spell payoffs, and there are a few of those at common and uncommon. We have Valdalian Arcanist, which is really nice because it helps you ramp into bigger spells. It can only be used for instant sorcery spells. You'll notice, by the way, all 3 of these creatures also wizards, so they really help you get wizards in your deck while also lining up with the spell-heavy idea that Blue-Red wants. Get to Chronicler, if you kick it, can get back an instant or sorcery. Get to Lava Runner becomes Goblin Guide, more or less. That's sort of the theme here, I guess, of the wizard. A lot of the wizard slash spell payoffs turn into really good cards from mediocre ones if you can get there. I don't love Get to Lava Runner here. The main reason being you're not going to be able to throw instants and sorceries into your graveyard quickly enough for it to be a 2/2 with haste, early enough for that to matter. It's not like you can play Gitaxian Probe in this format, you know, so that's something to keep in mind. I do think the Arcanist and the Chronicler are both really good. And so we've actually looked at almost all the wizards at common and uncommon, but there are 2 more who are neither a wizard payoff or a spell payoff. And just to mention them, they are Merfolk Trickster and Tolarian Scholar. Obviously, the Scholar isn't anything special. You may have seen the professor's really funny video revealing the card about how bad it is. It is actually, you know, playable and limited, especially because it has a useful creature type. But the Trickster is way better. Obviously, tapping stuff down is great. And, you know, turning off abilities doesn't hurt either. Neither does having Flash or being a 2-mana 2/2. So it's just a really good card. But that is all the wizards at common and uncommon. There are a lot of them, but most of them actually are nice because they already synergize with other wizards or they synergize with spells. These are the two exceptions to that at common or uncommon. Let's look at some rares that are going to be best suited in this particular deck. So one of these is the Mirari Conjecture. This is a card I'm really excited to play with in a deck where I can really get some action with it because Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, can basically draw you a card and one of your removal spells back from your graveyard, and then Chapter 3 doubles all your spells. So if you're getting like Wizard's Lightning back and casting it and doubling it, you're probably going to win that game. And Mirari Conjecture is like definitely only going to be good. Well, that might not be true, but it's going to be at its best in this deck because this deck already is interested in instants and sorceries. Naban, Dean of Iteration, is a wizard who has a wizard payoff ability. He makes triggers that happen because a wizard enters the battlefield happen twice. So if you play the Trickster, it gets to tap down 2 things. If you play the Journey Mage, it gets to bounce 2 things. So, you can get a lot of value out of Naban, but he's not always going to be a payoff because you may get all the wizard payoffs that don't actually trigger anything, although several of them do. Even the Journey Mage, not the Journey Mage, but the 3-mana 3/2 who does 2 damage if you have a wizard will suddenly do 4 damage, and that's a nice upgrade. Naru Meha, Master Wizard, is one of the best things you can possibly get in this deck, and it's a very first pickable card, and you'll be happy to take it, even if you're not in a wizard deck. But in a wizard deck, it gets nuts. It can copy instants or sorceries you control, so it's another card pushing you towards instants or sorceries, while simultaneously pushing you towards wizards, because it's a wizard lord. So, there you go. Precognition Field is a spell payoff, not a wizard payoff. It's kind of a weird card. You have to have a good number of instants or sorceries in your deck for it to really be worth it. But no matter what, it provides you some card selection, and that's kind of nice. Jaya Ballard is basically the only deck she'll be good in, I think. She's just, her +1 and her -8 are both really interested in you playing instants and sorceries, and that's what you'll be doing in this deck. You'll be playing a lot of those. If you have the right payoffs anyway, and her +1 that discards 3 cards and draws that many cards is always good, but the other 2 abilities are only good in a deck with a lot of instants and sorceries, which this deck is. So blue-red, it's about wizards, it's about spells. I think they did a good job designing this color pair. I think it's going to feel very synergistic, and the good news is it's mostly, anyway, our only tribal color pair here, which is a big relief after what we just dealt with in Ixalan, which every color pair was tribal. You could argue black-green is sort of tribal, the Saproling deck, which we'll get to later, but since it's creature tokens, I don't feel like it's the same thing, All right, so onward to our next color pair, which is black-white, where our signpost uncommon is Arvad the Cursed. 5-mana 3/3 with Death Touch and Lifelink, and he gives other legendary creatures you control +2/+2. So the main theme here in black-white is legendary/historic. Historic cards are all legendary, artifact, or saga cards. And there's a lot of all of those in this set. The black-white color pair, sort of pushes towards legendary the most of the ones that are interested in historic because of Arvad and because of a couple other cards we'll look at. But it can just be a historic deck. And there's also a small knight sub-theme, which I'll address at the end of talking about black-white, that is really only there if you pick up rares and mythics. But it's worth talking about because there are a lot of knights in this color pair. But first off, let's look at the legendary/historic payoffs in black and white that make it worth playing as many legendary creatures in your deck as you can. So, one example of this is Benalish Honor Guard, who gets +1/+0 for each legendary creature you control. It's not anything incredible, but hey, it definitely gets better in a deck with legendaries. Dominant Trapper, when you play a legendary or any other historic spell for that matter, it taps something. That's nice. Board the Weatherlight isn't a card I love, mostly because it just gives you card selection, not card advantage, and sometimes it's just not going to reveal anything you're super excited about. I don't know that I'll be playing it very much, but in interest of showing you everything, it's another card that cares about historic. Same with Sanctum Spirit. If you can discard historic spells, it gets indestructible until end of turn. Also has lifelink and decent stats. Sarah Disciple, every time you play a historic spell, including legendary creatures, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Blessing of Belzenlock, like Benalish Honor Guard, is specifically a bonus for legendary creatures, not any historic spells, just legendary creatures. And Blessing of Belzenlock gives a legendary creature lifelink in addition to the stats boost it gives to everything else. So it's a nice little bit of upside for this deck. Next we have Cabal Paladin, who anytime you play any historic spell does 2 damage to each opponent. There's also Lingering Phantom, who can come back from the graveyard anytime you play a historic spell. It comes back to your hand if you can pay 1 black mana. This is the color pair that has like a critical mass of legendary creatures at common and uncommon. But at the same time, the only two cards you have, well, three cards you have that really push you towards Legendary are Arvad, the Benalish Honor Guard, and Blessing of Belzenlok. And the latter two really aren't that impactful. So this deck can definitely run some artifacts and sagas. It's not only interested in legendary creatures. There's just more of a legendary creature, a push towards them in this color pair than in the other historic color pairs, which we'll get to later. And part of that is because Black-White has more legendary creatures at uncommon than any other color pair. So, for example, you have Baird, Steward of Argive, and they're all pretty good, basically. Danitha, Capuchin, Paragon, Quende, Pride of Femeref. That one's really, I think it's actually going to be better in the red-white deck, which we'll talk about later, but it's fine here. Urgaros, the Empty One, Whisper, Blood Liturgist, and Yargle, Glutton of Urborg, not to mention On Sarah's Wings, which can turn one of your creatures into a legendary creature if it wasn't already, which Arvad will like a lot, and so will your Benalish Honor Guard and your Belzenlok combat trick thing. So there are lots of legendary creatures here. They are all uncommon, and keep that in mind. I think some people are thinking you're going to have like a 10 legendary creature deck, and I just don't think that's going to happen that often. Part of the problem is all of these cards are pretty good. The only ones who you're not pretty happy to be playing in your deck are really just Yargle. I mean, you know, and he's fine, especially if you can slap On Sarah's Wings on him, and if you have enough legendary payoff in your deck and historic payoff, he's fine. He's just not great. The rest of them are all quite powerful anyway, and so you'll be happy to be putting them in your deck. So let's look at some rares that are best suited to this deck. So because you're playing legendary creatures, it means you sort of have a leg up on legendary sorceries. So both the legendary sorceries in this color pair, both of which are quite strong, you can play. And in fact, Urza's Ruinous Blast actually pays you off for having legendary permanents in play because it won't exile them. Yawgmoth's Vile Offering doesn't really give you a payoff for having legendary permanents, except that you can cast a ridiculous spell, which it is. There's also Teshar, Ancestor's Apostle, who happens to be legendary, and who happens to also, every time you play a historic spell, including legendaries, return a creature with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Daring Archaeologist is going to be... It's a card that has a historic payoff that actually pushes you more towards artifacts than it does towards legendaries, but it's still going to be good in this deck, and you'll probably be running a few artifacts anyway, and it can get those back. It's good even if you can't get back an artifact, but if you can, it's great. Weatherlight, obviously, is good in a lot of decks, basically any deck, but this deck will have a critical mass of historic spells, and so, you know, you're going to be hitting something off of it every time it hits your opponent, and it happens to be a historic spell itself. Primeval's Glorious Rebirth, this is the home for it. I mean, it's black-white, it's telling you to play it, but I'm going to recommend you don't for the most part. Occasionally it'll come together, but first of all, it's a legendary sorcery, so you not only have to have a legendary creature in play to cast it, but you also need to have a bunch of legendary permanents in your graveyard for it to be worth casting. And having both of those going on isn't going to be a really easy thing to accomplish. There are some ways that black can put cards into its graveyard, and we'll talk about those more in other color pairs that seem to be pushing you in that direction a little harder, but it's a cool card. It looks like it'll be a lot of fun in like Commander and places like that, but I don't think it's actually that good. But maybe this will be, if a color pair can pull it off, obviously enough, black-white is going to be it. So there you go. So I promised I'd talk about knights briefly, and I will. So this color pair has a lot of knights. You may have noticed that a bunch of the creatures we mentioned were knights, but all of the payoffs, or I should say, both of the payoffs for having knights are rare or mythic. So Ariel is a ridiculous card. It's one of the biggest bombs in the format. Even though it's gold, you should probably first pick it in most cases. It's a creature token engine, and it turns all your knights into assistants, basically, for removing your opponent's creatures. History of Benalia, obviously, is a really strong card. It's more aggressive than Ariel, but they both work well together. They both really like having knights in play. And then there's also Knight of Malice and Knight of Grace, who are sort of signpost uncommons, like backdoor signpost uncommons you might not notice. But they actually are best in a deck together, even though flavor-wise they hate each other. They're actually best in the deck together because if you always are playing white with Knight of Malice and you're always playing black with Knight of Grace, they're going to get that +1/+0. Your opponent isn't the only one who can have it to pump the creatures. So those are just two knights I wanted to show you that sort of are pushing you into, showing you that black-white is sort of the home for knights. But it's not going to be a knight deck. You're not going to be like, yeah, I'm drafting black-white knights. Nope, it's not going to happen unless you get either Ariel or History of Benalia or both. But it is a sub-theme in the color pair. A lot of the creatures just happen to be knights, so they synergize well with History of Benalia and Ariel. There's also, Dub, which can make a creature into a knight, but that'll again only be relevant with Ariel and History of Benalia, so keep that in mind. So that's black-white. It's mostly about legendary creatures and historic more broadly, and also sort of kind of about knights. Now let's move into red-green. So our red-green signpost uncommon is Halar the Fire Fletcher, who's a 3-mana 3/3 with Trample. Already great. Every time you cast a spell, if it was kicked, Halar gets a +1/+1 counter and then shoots your opponent in the face for damage equal to the number of +1/+1 counters on it. So red-green is the kicker deck. That's what this is showing us. But it's more than that. It's also a ramp color pair. And this is because kicker costs and using them is very mana intensive for some cards. And this color pair is pretty good at generating mana so that it can make sure it's kicking spells to make Halar the Fire Fletcher trigger. So it's a kicker deck and a ramp deck. And while there's a kicker thing going on, there's only 2 other kicker payoffs, and they're both, one's common and one's uncommon. And those are Bloodstone Goblin and Elfhame Druid. And they're both going to be good if you can kick a lot of spells for sure. But clearly there's not so many kicker payoffs that this deck is all about kicker. I'm going to show you all of the different kicker cards, and red-green, this is where you have the most of them by far at common and uncommon, so that's why the signpost uncommon cares about it. But other than that, these are the only other 2 cards that care about it. But so kicker is sort of, I feel like it's more of a sub-theme in what is either like a red-green mid-range or red-green ramp deck. But let's look at all the cards with kicker to really drive home the fact that there's tons of kicker in this color pair, especially compared to some of the others. So one example is Fight with Fire, which is just a ridiculous removal spell. If you can kick it, and if you're in a ramp deck, maybe you can, it's probably just going to kill your opponent. We see Get to Chronicler again. He's good in the Wizard deck. He'll be good here too because you can kick him in the late game and get back a removal spell, maybe one with kicker, and just really have Halar shoot your opponent in the face over and over again. Goblin Barrage has a kicker cost that is not mana, but you do need to have artifacts or goblins, so that's something to keep in mind. You may not actually want to play it in this deck. Well, you probably still would, because it's still a reasonable removal spell if you don't, but if you can't kick it all the time, it's not going to be as good, let's say. Keldon Overseer, another one who has a really prohibitive mana cost. Like, you have to pay 7, but if you can do it, he's going to be great. Again, that's why this color pair is good at ramping. I mean, we even saw that the Elfhame Druid is good at making extra mana for kicker. So that's both kicker and ramp in one card. Sheevan Fire, again, can cost up to 5 mana, but that's going to be easier for this deck to do than most. Skizzik, another card with kicker who's a nice aggressive guy. And the cool thing about this color pair, I think, is that your threats and your win conditions are things you can just play early, like Baloth Gorger on turn 4, or they're things you can also ramp into. Your cards sort of serve double duty. They can be things you ramp into, and that's the thing about a lot of these cards with kicker is if you can ramp to them, they're going to be more powerful because you can pay the kicker cost, right? And there's a lot of cards with kicker that get even better when you can pay the kicker, so they're very flexible, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And that's a nice thing that this color pair has going on in terms of ramp, thanks to all of the kicker costs that are around, like Get to Chronicler, Baloth Gorger, Keldon Overseer. Those are kicker costs on creatures that a lot of decks won't be able to pay consistently, but this one will be able to do it a little bit better than most. So it's also Gift of Growth. It's a nice trick. It's not nearly as impactful as basically anything else we've looked at, but hey, it gets better if you can kick it. Grow from the Ashes is here. It can enable some splashes, which is nice. It'll, and it ramps you, so it fits well into what this deck is doing by both being a kicker spell and a ramp spell. There's, of course, Grun the Lonely King, who is one of the better things you can want to ramp into in this deck, either as the 6-mana 5/5 version or the 6-mana 9/9 version. 10/10 version, that is. Crows and Druid, another one who it's like, in the early game it's fine to play, but in the late game, if you can ramp into it, the 10 life can really make you win. Saproling Migration, nice that it can help you go wide. It can make you go even wider if you can kick it. Untamed Kavu is one of the best cards in the set in general at common or uncommon, and it's really good here. It's another card that's good early and good late. So, playing him kicked on turn 4 or even 3 with the Elfhame Druid is pretty sweet. Hopefully we can all pull that off a few times. Wild Onslaught is better in the go wide decks that are around, but it's okay here because it has kicker, basically. So, cool thing we have going on here is the spells get more powerful in the late game and the creatures get more powerful in the late game because of all the kicker, but in the early game, most of them are actually still pretty good. So you don't have to throw a 6-mana 6/6 into your deck just because you need something to ramp into. Your cards that are 4-mana 4/4s early are going to be monsters in the late game. So it works out pretty well. I kind of like what's going on here. So the ramping that's in the deck, in addition from Grow from the Ashes, are basically these 4 cards. And the good news is 3 of them are common, so it's not going to be that hard to get them. Song of Freyalise is not common, and it's nice because it also helps you splash. And the Chapter 3 on it obviously makes your whole board a real problem for a turn. So Llanowar Scout is ramp, but it's not as good as Llanowar Elves for one reason, and that is you can't guarantee you're going to have a land to put into play. You don't, like, when you play Llanowar Elves, you know it's going to produce green mana if you untap. If you play Llanowar Scout on turn 2, don't have any extra lands in your hand anyway, like you just play a 3rd land, and then you're done, you don't have anything else to do, it's not going to ramp you. But still, Skirk Prospector also helps you ramp. It's a nice red card that helps you ramp. It does get better with more goblins. There are several of them in red, including one of the kicker payoffs, so occasionally you'll want to sacrifice goblins to make a huge kicked spell. Let's look at some of the rares for this deck. Well, there's one that's ridiculous in any deck, but hey, it has kicker, so let's throw it in here, and that is Varric's Bladewing. He's good at any stage of the game, but if you can ramp into him and make the 2 dragon tokens, or the 2 dragon creatures, I should say, he's great. Marwyn the Nurturer is good here because she helps you ramp, and because, all green decks have a chance at having lots of elves in them, but the decks that are interested in ramping will run more elves because, like, Llanowar Scout isn't going to be as good in your typical deck as it is in this one. Territorial Allosaurus is just great when you kick him. He's fine if you don't, but great if you do. Verdant Forest is something you can ramp into that doesn't have kicker, but it is very powerful. Grand Warlord Radha is sort of a signpost rare in that she's sort of pushing you towards something in her color pair, and that is both aggression and ramping. And she can ramp your deck like crazy if you've gone wide early, and allow you to play a huge kicked spell on the next turn or whatever, and that's really great about her. She's a very strong card. She's another gold card that I think is worth first picking. If you haven't seen my full set review, that's what I said about her, and she's pretty great. So that is red-green. It is, sort of a kicker deck, sort of a ramp deck. Those 2 things actually work really well together, though, so it's not actually that awkward that they're going in 2 different directions, because those 2 directions are definitely related to one another. The next color pair we want to look at is blue-white, and it is another color pair that cares about historic. In this case, the Signpost Common actually is good for all historic spells, and I do kind of like the Signpost Uncommons that work on all historic spells and not on a specific kind, like Arvadu only pumps legendary creatures. I mean, he'd be ridiculous if he could pump all artifact creatures too, I guess, but Wrath Capuchin is broader, so it's about all historic spells, artifacts, legendaries, sagas, it doesn't care. And he's got awesome stats himself as a 4-mana 3/3 Flash Flying, which would already be a really good card, but he also gives all your historic spells. Flash can be especially impactful with sagas because they do something that normally isn't, most of them anyway, do things that aren't normally instant speed things, and you can flash them in and get Chapter 1, and then on your draw step you get Chapter 2, so sort of jump starts your sagas, which is cool, but he's good with anything. Anytime you can leave mana up and make your opponent really think about what they can do, and then you're like, just flashing a guy at their end of the turn if you don't get to use a removal spell or your counter spell or whatever, that always feels really good. So let's look at the other historic payoffs in blue-white. So we have Artificer's Assistant, which lets you scry every time you play a historic spell. Diligent Excavator is an interesting one. It could either enable a mill deck, I guess, which I'm less interested in doing because mill is such an unreliable strategy because it doesn't really matter that you're milling your opponent until they're at 0 cards. Otherwise, you're not affecting the board in any impactful way, and, that's a problem. I think more frequently she will actually mill you because you're interested in getting things in your graveyard that you can then get back with some other cards. But, maybe if you end up with like 10 historic spells and like 3 Diligent Excavators, you should think about a mill deck. You probably should at that point, actually, but it's not going to happen that often. Relic Runner is a nice little creature who becomes unblockable when you play a historic spell. Sage of Latnam isn't a historic payoff specifically, but it does like artifacts, and I think blue-white, in some ways, as we'll see, is pushing you towards artifacts more than legendaries, the way that black-white sort of pushes you more towards legendaries. Board the Weatherlights here again. We've seen Dominant Trapper. Excavation Element's one of the reasons that blue-white is pushing you a little more towards artifacts, along with Sage of Latnam, because it can help you get back artifacts from your graveyard. Sanctum Spirit can allow you to discard a historic card, and then you can actually get it back with something like Excavation Element, for example, which is nice. Sarah Disciple gets bigger every time you play a historic spell. Guardians of Koilos lets you bounce one of your historic creatures. Joyra's Familiar is great because it makes all your historic spells cost 1 less, which is quite strong because that's a significant percentage of spells in this format. Urza's Tome lets you just draw instead of looting in a world where you have a historic permanent in your graveyard and you can exile it. Curator's Ward is nice, gives a creature hexproof, and if that creature was historic when it dies, it's not actually just creatures either, it's permanents. When that permanent goes away, you get to draw 2 cards if it was historic. So blue-white has, a couple cards pushing you more towards artifacts, but it is a lot broader than black-white. It's more interested more broadly in historic, and I like that a little bit more. Some rares that are well suited to this deck include Traxos, Scourge of Krug. He cares about historic permanents. He is a historic permanent. He's also an artifact, so your 2 cards that care about artifacts, are going to be extra good with him. Getting him back with Excavator Element would be nice. Weatherlight again, it's good in any historic deck. It's good in any deck, but the historic decks for sure. Mishra's Self-Replicator is good here. You can pay 1 and make a copy of the replicator, and then when you have 2, you can pay 2 and make 2 copies, and etc. That's pretty great. During Archaeologist is actually better here than it was in the black-white deck because I think you'll more consistently have artifacts in your graveyard because you have a little more incentive to have them. Teshar Ancestor's Apostle lets you return historic spells from your graveyard, which we've, not historic, any creature with converted mana costs 3 or less, but when you cast a historic spell, you get to return a creature. And Zahid is a rare who's sort of pushing you in the direction of artifacts too, the way Daring Archaeologist is, because you can pay him for 4 mana, play him for 4 mana if you have a artifact in play. So there's a couple rares and a common and an uncommon that say, hey, run artifacts, and that's sort of the main direction it's pushing you in to some extent. But sometimes it'll be just a more broad historic deck. Sometimes you'll just be more artifact heavy, legendary, or saga heavy. Teferi fits into this color pair. He doesn't actually synergize specially here. I include him here just because he's in your color pair, I guess. He doesn't do anything special with any historic permanents, except that he is one himself. The Antiquities War, so this is another rare that pushes you really hard towards artifacts because you can draw artifacts out of your library, and then in Chapter 3, it turns all your artifacts into 5/5s, and that's often going to be enough to just swing for lethal, or at least swing in a way that makes your opponent very uncomfortable. So that's blue-white. Next, let's look at green-white. All right, so our green-white signpost uncommon is Shana, Sisei's Legacy, which for a green and a white, I can tell you that. In green-white, our signpost common is Shanna, Sisei's Legacy. It's another legendary creature, of course. It only costs 2 mana. It is a creature who is as big as the number of creatures you have in play, and it has half of hexproof. It can't be the target of abilities your opponents control. It can be the target of spells. She's another one who's pretty straightforward in telling you what you want to be doing. Green-white wants to be going wide. It has multiple ways of making tokens, and that's what it wants you to do. It has some ways of pumping the whole board, and it has ways of making tokens. And that, and Shanna gets better the more creatures you have in play. So let's go ahead and look at the various ways this color pair can go wide. So there's a bunch of things that make Saprolings, for one thing. All the green cards that make Saprolings are good here. Fungal Plots, it doesn't help you go as wide as some of the others do, mostly because it has to have a creature die so that you can turn it into something, but you can look at it as going wide because even if your creature dies, you can make sure there's a body in play, basically, if you exile it. Saproling Migration, on the other hand, does make sure there are multiple bodies in play, and it can go the wider the later in the game it is if you can kick it. Spore Swarm really helps you go wide, making 3 tokens for 1 card. Yavimaya's Shepherd gives you 2 bodies. Call the Cavalry gives you 2 bodies. Sergeant at Arms, if you kick it, gives you 3 bodies. And Memorial to Glory gives you 2 bodies. And so most of these are actually commons, if you didn't notice. Spore Swarm and Fungal Plots are not, but Sapling Migration, Yavimaya, Sap Herd, I think I said Shepherd, I always say Shepherd. Call the Cavalry and Sergeant at Arms are all common, and they're all very good. So, these are the ways the deck has to go wide. These are the ways next we're going to look at how it can pump the whole board. And those include Charge, which for 1 mana can pump everything, which is a pretty good rate. Spore Crown Thallid, which only really pumps your whole board if your board consists of Saprolings and Fungus. And this color pair isn't the greatest place for it, but sometimes you'll get there. Sometimes you'll have multiple ways of making Saprolings and a few Fungus creatures, and then it's going to be pretty good. But it is better in the black-green deck. Wild Onslaught I don't love, but it does help you go, if you have 8 mana lying around, it's going to kill your opponent basically. For 4, it may not kill your opponent as often. For 4, it's really not that much better than charge. Like, it costs 4 times as much as charge, and it just puts a counter on everything, which, yeah, that's permanent. But most of the time when you pump your whole board, you just want to win the game, like on the spot, and that's kind of the point. And it doesn't do that for you. Song of Freyalise is a little slow. For the first 2 chapters, though, you can ramp, play even more things. And then when you get to chapter 3, it pumps your whole board, putting a +1/+1 counter on them, and making it so they're all basically impossible to block profitably because they have Indestructible along with Vigilance and Trample. So those are the ways it has to pump. This color pair is also just good at aggro. Like, obviously your deck's not just going to be ways of making Knight tokens, Soldier tokens, and Saprolings. You also want to have a low curve in this deck so that when you pump your whole board, it's even better. And some of the like little aggressive creatures for this colored pair are things like Corrosive Ooze, Untamed Kavu, Benelish Honor Guard, Dauntless Bodyguard, Mesa Unicorn, Pegasus Courser. So, you know, this isn't a list of every cheap creature in this color pair, but these guys are going to be good here too. Ideally, though, you do want to be making Saprolings, Knights, or Soldiers. Let's look at the rares for this color pair. Shalai, Voice of Plenty, is sort of a signpost rare. It can pump your whole board while also giving protection to your whole board, hexproof to your whole board except itself. Benelish Marshal's a mass pump effect. It's an anthem. Hard to cast, but if you can, it's going to be great in this deck. Sylvan Awakening, you know, if there's any deck for it, I kind of feel like this is the one because it really helps you go wide. If you have enough lands in play, you know, you say you have 10 in play and you cast this, and then you have 7 lands that are 2/2s, and then you play charge, like, it's going to be pretty nice. But it's not a great card just in general, so keep that in mind. All right, so that's green-white. You want to go wide, you want to pump your whole board. Pretty straightforward color pair. Let's look at black-green now. Black-green is another color pair that wants to go wide, but it wants to do some different things while going wide. The signpost uncommon is Slimefoot the Stowaway, who's a fungus. When Saprolings die, he drains the opponent 1 life, and he's a great mana sink, and he can just make a Saproling for every 4 mana you have when you feel like it. So this is the color pair I mentioned. You know, the also can go wide, but it's specifically, most specifically anyway, interested in making Saprolings. So let's look at the ways this color pair can make Saprolings. Some of them we've already seen, some we haven't, because we're also looking at black. Fungal Infection gives you a Saproling while also giving the creature -1/-1. It can be a 2-for-1 in a lot of scenarios. It's nice. Death Bloom Thallid gives you 2 bodies, but it does it a little more slowly in that, you know, it doesn't give you 2 bodies right away. It gives you that second body when it dies. Fungal Plots is here again. It's better in this deck than it is in the general Go Wide deck because of the second activated ability Fungal Plots has. This color pair is better at making Saprolings. So sacrificing 2 Saprolings and gaining 2 life and drawing a card is an easier thing to do. So keep that in mind. This color pair is also interested in sacrificing stuff, and so you'll have creatures in your graveyard more regularly. Saproling Migration again, Spore Swarm, Yavimaya Shepherd. You know, we've seen these. Sapherd, that is. It's like, it's, you know, Shepherd's a real word, and Sapherd just, you know, doesn't register in my brain. So these are the ways of making Saprolings in this color pair. Again, a lot of them are common. Yavimaya Shepherd, Fungal Infection, Deathbloom Thallid, and Saproling Migration are all common, so getting multiples of them isn't impossible. And this is, of course, in addition to Slimefoot. There's a few Saproling payoffs. Spore Crown Thallid and Fungal Plots are going to be better here, like I said, than they are in the green-white Go Wide deck because you can make more Saprolings. And Thallid Omnivore, you know, it's good even if you don't have Saprolings, but if you're killing Saprolings and sacrificing them to Thallid Omnivore and gaining 2 life at the same time, that doesn't hurt. There's also a sacrifice sub-theme here, and if you're going really wide, obviously, you know, throwing away a Saproling isn't a big deal, and these 3 cards I think are going to be good here because of it. Thallid Soothsayer is also a fungus, so it plays with a little bit of a fungus upside because of Spore Crown Thallid, but it can draw you cards. Vicious Offering, you know, if you can easily just throw away a Saproling to give something -5/-5, that's great. And Whisper lets you throw away potentially 2 Saprolings to reanimate something a lot scarier. So this color pair does also like mass pump, but there's not as much of it here. So the green-white deck is better at going wide and pumping the whole board, and green-black is better at getting value out of sacrificing creatures, basically. So the mass pump we've already seen. Song of Freyalise and Wild Onslaught. Let's look at some of the rares that are good in this color pair. Rite of Belzenlock is good because it not only helps you go wide by making the cleric tokens, it also gives you a creature who has to eat a creature every upkeep or it hits you for 6 damage. It'll be good, for you to have Saprolings to sacrifice to that if you run out of the clerics. Torgar is going to be really good here. I mean, if you can just cast Saproling Migration on turn 2, attack for 2 with them once, and then on turn 4 play Torgar, which you can do, and that's with a common. It's not an insane thing. That's going to feel really great. He's just going to really dominate a game if he comes down that early. And of course, Verdant Force makes Saprolings in addition to being a huge creature itself. So black-green, it's about Saprolings. It's about going wide, but with Saprolings specifically, the only other way it has of going wide is with Rite of Belzenlock, and that's a rare. So maybe you'll have some cleric tokens too, but mostly it'll be about Saprolings. Next, let's look at red-white. The red-white Sunbow uncommon is Tiana, Ship's Caretaker. So she's an interesting one. So she's got flying and first strike. In addition to that, though, anytime an aura or equipment you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you may return that card to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next instep. So this is an interesting card. She has keyword abilities, and she saves your auras and your equipment. And so that's nice. So together with all of that, basically this is an aura and equipment deck. In addition to having 2 keyword abilities, she makes it so your aura and equipment just doesn't stay dead, and that's nice. However, her block of text about auras and equipment isn't incredible. This is because equipment is rarely going to go to the graveyard, at least in game 1. In game 2, it might happen a little more regularly. The aura part, I think, is the most relevant part on her because, one of the big risks of playing auras is getting 2 for 1, and she saves them. The problem is, if you want to put auras or equipment on her, which you kind of do because she has flying and first strike, it's not going to work out if they kill her. So, I like her. She's going to be strong, but sometimes it's actually going to be better to put the auras and equipment somewhere else because then your opponent's really left with the difficult decision. So ideally, I think you have to put them other places, even though she's a good place to put them. And if in a pinch, you will put them on her, and those keyword abilities will make them strong at least. But usually putting them somewhere else and making your opponent really mad that they're like, great, if I kill this creature with an aura, they're going to get the aura back anyway. And then maybe you do slap it on Tiana because you have nowhere else to put it. So let's look at the aura and equipment payoffs that are in red-white. There aren't a ton of them. There's really only 3, maybe 3.5. Danitha Capuchin reduces the casting cost of equipments and auras, which is great. Has 3 keyword abilities, so putting them on her is great. Champion of the Flame really likes equipment and auras. He gets bigger the more he has on him. Valduk, Keeper of the Flame, is also great. You'll notice all 3 of these payoffs are uncommon, and that's a little bit of a problem, but we'll talk more about that in a second. Each equipment he has on him makes him spit out a Spark Elemental every turn, and that's great. You can even move equipment onto Spark Elementals, and since they have Trample, that wouldn't hurt. Generally, I don't think you want to move them unless you just have a ton of mana. And there's also Tragic Poet, which is less of a payoff, but if your deck's playing a bunch of auras, Tragic Poet does get a lot better because it can get them back. Sort of like a bad version of Tiana. It can make it so you're not really getting 2 for 1, although you still sort of are because you're giving up your Tragic Poet. But if there's anywhere you're going to play Tragic Poet, this might be it. It's also good with sagas, and obviously that, is something to keep in mind. But there's not really a saga deck that we're going to be talking about here today. There's just sagas, a few of them around, and Tragic Poet can get them. So these are the payoffs for auras and equipment. Now let's look at the auras and equipment in red-white that make these aura and equipment payoffs worth it. So On Sarah's Wings is probably the strongest aura of them all. It is 4 mana to cast, and that will occasionally be a real pain, especially if your opponent has removal in response, or a bounce spell even. But it's the kind of aura that if you get it on your creature and it stays there, you're just going to win the game. It's extra good in this deck because maybe it'll cost 1 less. You have good creatures with keyword abilities to put them on. We're going to talk about those in a second. You can get it back from the graveyard if you need to with the help of things like Tiana. And so, it's pretty good. This is the best place for it, although it'll be good in basically any white deck, I think. Dub also makes a creature quite large and difficult to deal with. It has the same problem all auras have, and it doesn't have the same kind of payoff on Sarah's Wings does. Frenzied Rage is another one that makes a creature. This one makes creatures hard to block. And that's really it for the auras. There's 2 at common and 1 at uncommon in the color pair. And, this is the best deck for them. Surprisingly, they didn't print a ton of offensive auras in this set, despite the fact that it's sort of a sub-theme. But to compensate for that, they did print a bunch of equipment at common and uncommon that'll work well in this deck. That includes Jousting Lance, which I don't think is great, but you'll play it in this deck. It's fine. Shield of the Realm, I think, is better. It's easy to cast, and equipping it is really cheap. And preventing 2 damage can be a real issue. Short Sword just does stuff very efficiently. I think it's the best of all the common and uncommon equipment, which we've now looked at. So, these 6 cards are things you should be on the lookout for if you're in red-white and you have equipment and aura payoffs. Sometimes this will just be an aggro deck because there's just not really a critical mass of payoffs. We saw that they're all uncommon, and so sometimes this will just be an aggressive deck. And cards like On Sarah's Wing, Dub, and Frenzied Rage, and Short Sword at least, those all just be good in a regular aggro deck. But, the real synergy you're trying to find here is equipment and auras in an ideal situation. So let's look at the creatures that are good for you to be enhancing with these auras and equipment. And red-white rather has a lot of them. Basically, creatures with keyword abilities. So, equipping an Aven Sentry with even something as innocuous as a Short Sword is a real problem because of flying. Baird has Vigilance, so if you equip him with something, he's able to attack and block effectively. Knight of Grace has First Strike, not to mention Hexproof from Black, etc. Quende, Pride of Femaref, this probably is the best place for him because red and white is where you find the most First Strike, and he's going to be able to give double strike to your creatures more frequently in this color pair than anywhere else. I mean, you can give Knight of Grace double strike, for example. Mesa Unicorn has Lifelink. Pegasus Courser has flying itself, and it can give something else flying. Sanctum Spirit can be indestructible, and it has Lifelink. It's actually a really good place to be putting auras because your opponent doesn't know whether or not you can keep it alive by discarding something, and sometimes you'll be able to and sometimes you won't, but they always have to respect the threat of activation. And if you really have ways to protect it and you put the +2/+1 Menace aura on it, they're going to be in some trouble. Sarah Angel, of course, has Vigilance and Flying. Sarah Disciple's fine here because your equipment is all historic, and it also has Flying and First Strike. Skizik has Trample. Warcry Phoenix has Flying. Jorah's Familiar's fine here, especially if you have more equipment than auras and a few of these legendary creatures. So, that's really the creatures you really want to enhance. You also want to be running a few ways to protect your creatures. One of the big problems with auras is the fact that, you can easily get 2 for 1. And there's a few cards that can help you with that. And again, Sanctum Spirit's one of the best places to put them because it can keep itself from dying. But Adamant Will, Dauntless Bodyguard, and Healing Grace all allow you to protect a creature who's equipped, to a lesser extent equipped, and especially creatures with auras. Like, if you have a couple On Sarah's Wings, I think Adamant Will and Dauntless Bodyguard go way up. Healing Grace isn't as good because sometimes it won't really actually protect the creature. If it's just a kill spell, it won't help. But it does prevent damage, and occasionally that'll matter. I definitely think the Bodyguard and the Will are better ways of protecting them. Let's look at the rares that are best suited to this deck. So there's some rare equipment, like Forebear's Blade, which I like a fair amount. I think it's the best equipment in this set at any rarity, just because it starts equipping for free after the first time you equip it. When your creatures who are equipped with it die, they get to pick up the sword. Your other creatures do for free. Blackblade Reforged is like super underwhelming, which is kind of a disappointment. If you have enough legendary creatures, you probably run it and feel okay about it in this deck. But you're never gonna. You're usually only gonna have like 4 or 5, and that's a lot. Sometimes you'll get more and it'll be better, but the fact it doesn't give evasion sucks. But as I just showed you, a lot of white and red creatures have evasion or keyword abilities that make it hard to block. So this is the home for it, but the equip cost of 7 is so prohibitive that you won't ever pay that in most situations. You just want to play it if you have enough legendary creatures. Two-Headed Giant is nice to put stuff on because he has both, potentially can have either Double Strike or Menace. So, if you're equipping him with things, he gets bigger. If he gains Double Strike or Menace with those, he's a real problem. Evra, Halcyon Witness, has lifelink, and she becomes more powerful the more power she has because it becomes a little less dangerous to exchange your life total with her power. Shalai is excellent in this deck. That's because she gives hexproof to your whole board, so if you're putting auras on them, your creatures will be a lot safer. They'll have to kill Shalai first, and then the creature that has an aura on it that's killing them second, and that's pretty great. So those are the rares that I think are best suited to this deck. This deck is a red-white aggro deck with an equipment sub-theme, equipment aura sub-theme, let's say. Looks to be a lot of fun, I think, but sometimes it'll just be a red-white aggro deck. So on to the next color pair, which is blue-black. The blue-black signpost uncommon is Rona, Disciple of Gix. She lets you exile a historic card from your graveyard when she comes into play. You can cast non-land cards that are exiled with her, and you can pay 4 and tap her to exile the top card of your library. So it's another color pair that cares about historic, but this one's also interested in the graveyard, obviously enough. You're not getting your full value out of Rona unless she's exiling a historic card from your graveyard, which essentially draws you a card, basically. It becomes part of your hand once she starts exiling things. Her activated ability is a little expensive, but it's a good way to win a long, grindy game. I mean, if you're exiling lands, at least you're not going to draw them in the late game. And if you're exiling spells she can actually cast, then you're sort of drawing a card for 4 mana every turn, which is kind of a pain. It's sort of like you're scrying, I guess. More like, well, it's somewhere between scrying and drawing a card. It's a weird effect. But that effect can cast anything, not just historic permanents, but her activated ability or Enter the Battlefield ability is pushing you towards having historic permanents in your graveyard. So let's look at some of the ways this color pair can stock the graveyard for a card like Rona to be at full value. So we have Diligent Excavator, which we saw earlier. I think you're going to want to mill yourself with it more than you want to mill your opponent. It's also a historic payoff, so it doubly synergizes here. Hummerid Explorer can mill you or your opponent. Again, I think you want to mill yourself. Sage of Latnam is nice with Rona, especially because you can sacrifice an artifact to draw a card, play Rona, and exile that artifact, and then cast it again. Weight of Memory is a strong draw spell that also mills 3 cards from either your library or your opponent's. Again, in this color pair, usually you're going to want to mill your own. It is worth noting, though, that if you're going to be building a mill deck, this is the color pair for it. As you can see, we've already seen, a common in Hummerid Explorer, an uncommon in Diligent Excavator, and an uncommon in Weight of Memory who can mill the opponent. So, if you manage to pick up multiples of especially the Excavator and the Explorer and have a bunch of historic spells, it is possible. I just don't think it'll come together all that often. Dark Bargain lets you draw cards, and the one you look at the top 3 cards, and the one you don't want goes in your graveyard. Final Parting lets you search your library for 2 cards. 1 goes in your hand, 1 goes in your graveyard. Windgrace Acolyte provides some nice evasive stats while also milling the top 3 cards of your library. This one makes you do your own library. The black cards all make you do your own library, and you don't have a choice, so that's worth keeping in mind. That's what I think kind of keeps the blue-black deck in check from being a really good mill deck. But it also gains you life, so that doesn't hurt. So what are some of the ways that blue-black can use their graveyard, in addition to Rona, who we already saw? Well, there is the Eldest Reborn, which is a straight-up reanimation spell, eventually. It's slow, but if you're able to mill or discard or whatever, a big, scary reanimation target, like Slinvada, for example, on Chapter 3, you can get it back. You can also get back anything your opponent has in their graveyard, which doesn't hurt. Similarly, Whisper Blood Liturgist also lets you reanimate things. So if you're going to be reanimating stuff, this is kind of the color pair. Blue stocks your graveyard better than black does, but black can reanimate stuff. Lingering Phantom, if you mill it, you don't really care. It's also a historic payoff, so it synergizes, again, doubly with this color pair because you can get it back for 1 black mana. Soul Salvage lets you get back 2 creatures from your graveyard, and if you're stocking your graveyard regularly, you're basically going to be drawing 2 cards with it and the 2 best creatures out of your graveyard. And there's also Memorial to Folly, which lets you return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So blue doesn't really provide any ways to use your graveyard apart from Rona, the gold card, right? But black provides the cards that can actually use the graveyard as a resource, and blue provides the ways to mill yourself for the most part. So that's sort of how they work together. There are other historic payoffs in blue-black. So this deck, I think it's first and foremost a historic deck, and secondarily, it's a deck that can do some graveyard shenanigans. So some of the historic payoffs, some of them we've already seen, are things like Artificer's Assistant, which lets you scry, Curator's Ward, which lets you draw 2 cards if if the creature dies or permanent dies and it's historic. Relic Runner becomes unblockable if you cast a historic spell. Cabal Paladin damages your opponent. Sentinel of the Pearl Trident allows you to exile one of your historic permanents, and then it comes back, so it's a way to help it dodge removal, a way to abuse and enter the battlefield ability. So again, this is sort of a historic deck. We saw some historic cards that really care about the graveyard to help you mill, and those I think are really at home in this deck because the graveyard becomes a resource in this deck the way it doesn't in most other decks in this format. So let's look at the rares that support this blue-black deck. So again, because it's a historic payoff, you might be pushed towards playing more legendary creatures. So Yawgmoth's Vile Offering is doubly possible here, both because it gives you another reanimation spell. So you can have like 3 or 4 of them if you have multiples of Whisper and the Nicol Bolas Saga. And that's pretty nice because it gives you yet another reanimation spell. Lich's Mastery, you know, this card is tricky. If there's any deck for it, though, I think this is the one because the cool thing about this card is it lets you use your graveyard as a resource to not not lose the game, basically. So the more cards you have in your graveyard when you cast it, the better. So I think this is a good place for Lich's Mastery. It can really be a problem for your opponent if you play it and you have like 15 cards in your graveyard. You basically just gained a ton of life, and that is a big problem for your opponent. The Antiquities War, this I think is going to be a little bit better in color pairs that have more of an artifact sub-theme. Granted, this is historic, and sometimes you'll be more artifact heavy than anything, and this will be at its best when you do that, but obviously, blue-white is a little more interested in artifacts than this color pair is. The Miraria Conjecture, you know, again, this one's better in blue-red, but you do stock your graveyard here, and that makes it pretty good here, potentially. You do have to have a nice mix of instants and sorceries to make it work, but that seems possible. Karn's Temporal Sundering is the other legendary sorcery, and it'll be good here because you might be pushing towards playing more legendaries. There's also Phyrexian Scriptures. It's a mythic rare that does push you towards wanting more artifacts. So it's sort of it and Antiquities War are they're at higher rarities, but they're really the only big payoffs for artifacts in this color pair. But it's a good one. I mean, the fact that it makes it so that creatures who are artifact creatures don't die and it destroys everything else is just great. So those are the rares. Blue-black is a historic deck that has a graveyard sub-theme. Next, let's look at blue-green, where our signpost uncommon is Tatyova, Benthic, Druid. So blue-green is always sort of an interesting color pair in most limited formats. I guess I should say usually an interesting color pair. Mostly because it's not always given a card that's like super synergistic in any way. It's just given like a sweet value card. Like one of my favorite cards ever, River Hoopo, which you may have seen in my new intro animation in this video. You know, it didn't really synergize with anything in that set. It just was sweet. It drew you cards. It gained you life. And guess what? That's what Tatyova Benthic Druid does too. And you could say maybe the theme is landfall, and sure, I guess maybe, but there aren't any other payoffs for landfall, and there aren't a lot of ways of abusing this trigger. There are a few, and we'll talk about them. But basically, blue-green I think is a ramp deck, and I think that's what Tatyova is trying to tell us by saying, you know, the more lands you get into play, the better I get. And the reason I think it's a ramp deck is because blue has a lot more big monsters than the red-green color pair did. The red-green color pair was also a ramp deck, but it had a kicker sub-theme. And it didn't have any like huge monsters, for the most part. There's some exceptions, to play. Instead, it just played creatures who have kicker and get better in the late game. Blue provides some big, scary creatures to ramp into, which we'll talk about momentarily. And that makes you a little more interested in trying to get to a ton of mana just to play these huge, massive creatures, even at common, at uncommon. And green also, of course, provides a few of those as well. First, let's look at the ways that this deck can ramp. So there's Elfame Druid, again, which is better in a deck with a lot of kicker. This deck does have some, though. And it's a mana dork no matter what. Grow from the Ashes is really good for with Tatyova because you'll pay even if you're only paying 3, you get to put a land into play, draw a card, and gain a life. So then if you're kicking it, it gets even better. It becomes draw 4 cards basically, because you get 2 lands, put them into play, and then you gain 2 life and draw 2 cards. Llanowar Elves again, obviously. Llanowar Scout is sort of one of the ways that you can sort of abuse landfall. The problem is, like, as I already talked about, you're not always going to have a land to put into play with it. So, but still, maybe occasionally it lets you get 2 triggers in a turn, especially if you cast like a draw spell and you draw a few cards, and then Llanowar Scout lets you play another one. Maybe Tatyova draws you your second land, and then it lets you play it. So this probably is a good place for Llanowar Scout. There's also Song of Freyalise, which also helps you splash, and so does Grow from the Ashes. And I think if any color pair wants to be splashing, I think this is the one that wants to do it the most. Red-green can also do it, but I think this one wants to do it the most. Power Stone Shard, I think, will be at its best here, because this deck is interested in creating more absurd amounts of mana than the red-green deck is. And if you'll even probably play 1 Power Stone Shard, but when you get more, obviously it gets better. So what can you ramp into at common and uncommon? Well, this deck also has some cards with kicker, but not nearly as many. Academy Drake is one of these things that you can kick into in the late game, and it gives you a bigger body. Cloud Reader Sphinx, the earlier you play it, the better. If you're playing it on turn 4, it's great. If you're playing on turn 5, it's still good. But ramping into that seems really appealing to me. It also lets you scry and set up your draws. Cold Water Snapper is just a big, dumb creature with hexproof, but hey, if you play him earlier, he's obviously a lot better. In Bolus, his Clutches is the most powerful uncommon in the set, in my opinion, and ramping into it is just disgusting. Slinvada is one of the really big payoffs that blue provides that red just doesn't have when it pairs with green. A huge, ridiculously costed uncommon, but if you can play him, and especially if you can kick him, he can basically just win you the game, and that's pretty great. Untamed Kavu, so now we're looking at some cards with kicker, again, that if you can ramp into them and kick them, it feels great. Thorn Elemental, I think, is better here than in the red-green deck, because this deck's interested in creating more mana, I think, than the other one is. Primordial Worm, just, sort of the Colossal Dreadmaw of this set, just a big dude who is big, and that's about it. Baloth Gorger, you can ramp into him, and you can kick it so that it gets to be even bigger. So some rares that go well with this color pair are Gilded Lotus, of course. It really enables splashing, and again, if you want to be making absurd amounts of mana, that's the way to do it. Kamal's Druidic Vow. I don't like the card for the most part in Limited, but if there's a deck for it, it's this one because you can make absurd amounts of mana. The Mending of Dominaria is good in basically any green deck, but that Chapter 3, if you have the Signpost Uncommon Tatyova in play, will be one of the most disgusting things you can do in the format. If you're getting back 3 or 4 lands with it and drawing 3 cards and gaining 4 life, it's going to be great. And Multani really cares about lands too, and you can actually combo Multani with Tatyova. It's basically the only way where you can repeatedly play lands thanks to Multani, who can bounce lands. So that's a nice thing to keep in mind. So let's talk about splashing, because I think this color pair is more interested in it than red-green is. Blue-green doesn't really have any removal of its own. Red-green does. So what you want to splash usually, at least at common and uncommon, are removal spells like these that only have 1 colored mana symbol. So Seal Away, Eviscerate, Wizard's Lightning, Fight with Fire. These are the most powerful removal in the set at common or uncommon, basically, and you can splash them easily in this deck. And I think you do want to, because you're really short on removal in green-blue. So now let's move to black-red. In black-red, our Signpost Uncommon is Garna the Blood Flame. It is a weird one. It's doing so many things. It has Flash. It gets you creatures back from your graveyard that went there at some point during your turn when it enters the battlefield only. And it gives other creatures you control haste. So it's sort of pushing you in a lot of directions. The haste part seems like something you want in an aggro deck. The other part about the graveyard is at its best in a sacrifice or graveyard deck. And still, like, the haste part on it is nice, but like as a 5-drop, it's not really that great in your aggro deck either. It is a nice way to just get some surprise damage on your opponent, because you can flash it into play at the end of their turn, and they're like, oh, there's a 3/3 who can attack me. Oh, and by the way, everything you play on your turn will also have haste. So that will be nice. It isn't downside, but she's going in a lot of different directions. And the graveyard part, I think, is what's the most interesting about her. Trying to find ways to really abuse that is the idea. And unfortunately, because she costs 5, casting some of the black spells that put cards into your graveyard, like that mill you, like that 5 mana 3/2 flyer, and casting her in the same turn is going to be hard to do. Though if you can, that'll be pretty nice because it's to the graveyard from anywhere. The most likely way to abuse this, though, is either to use sacrifice effects that give you value and then play Garna, and then get back the things you sacrificed, which is pretty great, or just sort of attacking or blocking and trading with your opponent and then flashing her into play and getting a bunch of value out of her. Either way, the one thing she's asking you to do is play a bunch of creatures, right? She's asking you to play a bunch of creatures, and so I do think it's a fairly aggressive deck, because if you're not playing creatures, the haste doesn't matter. Getting creatures back from your graveyard doesn't matter. You want a lot of creatures. So first, though, let's look at the sacrifice sub-theme here. So we have Goblin Barrage, which we've seen before. It's the kind of thing where, you know, you can sacrifice an artifact or a goblin. If the artifact is a creature, then her activated ability can get it back, which is pretty nice. You know, you get that extra value, and then you just get the creature back if you cast her. Granted, that's an investment of 9 mana in a turn, so that might not always work out. Orcish Vandal's a nice place, though, because you don't have to pay any mana to sacrifice things, and you get them back with Garna after you play her. Similarly, Skirk Prospector's actually, like, if there's a really busted thing to do with Garna, it's probably going to involve Skirk Prospector and a few other goblins, because you're like, I make 6 red mana and play something scary, and then I also play Garna. So, and then you get back all the goblins, right? So that's one of the gross things to do. Whisper Blood Liturgist with Garna, also pretty gross, because you can reanimate something and pay those 2 creatures, and then, oh, by the way, I'm playing Garna and getting back those creatures I sacrificed. Similarly, Vicious Offering, you can kick it and not worry about the fact that you're giving up a creature. Thallid Soothsayer, you know, you can draw a couple cards and then just get them back. Thallid Omnivore, pretty gross too, if you sacrifice a couple creatures to it and then get them back. So sacrificing is one of the best ways to abuse Garna. And there are a couple other cards that like graveyard stuff in red-black, and those are Lingering Phantom, who we've seen and requires historic permanence, or Warcry Phoenix, who I don't think we have looked at yet, who likes you to be an aggressive deck, basically. So that's sort of what the deck has going on, but I think mostly, just most of the time, this is just a black-red aggro deck with a small graveyard sub-theme thanks to Garna. As you've noticed, there aren't that many graveyard payoffs. There's just a few. So it's mostly just an aggro deck. I think you'll actually get the most value out of Garna when you just like attack with everything, do some damage, play Garna and get them all back. Or block with everything, you know, kill some things, play Garna and get them all back, rather than any of the sacrifice shenanigans to do. There are some rares that are really good, like if you can somehow play Torgard, sacrifice like 3 creatures to him, play him for 2 black, and then play Garna and get them all back, that's great. Rite of Belzenlock lets you can sacrifice creatures and then get them back with it. So that was the last color pair. It's black-red. I think it's sort of the least clearly defined of all of them. I think it's, again, mostly an aggro deck that has to do with some sacrificing things. So this does not mean the end of my limited review in full. I still have a video to come out on the best commons and uncommons in the set, sort of a Cliff's Notes of my full set review, and a video on the top 10 bombs in the format. So keep your eyes out for those. And on Friday, I'll be posting my first draft video in the new format. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and share it so others can enjoy it too. And don't forget to subscribe so you can see all that future Dominaria content.